Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to, let's just say we're wading into some pretty dense legal waters. We're talking about India's proposed criminal justice overhaul. The Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita of 2023. We've got excerpts from Chapter 1, the preliminary bit. It's kind of the foundation for the whole thing, right? How crimes are defined, all that. And let me tell you, there's some seriously interesting stuff in here. It's going to be a wild ride for anyone who cares about justice or even just how societies decide right and wrong.
It really is like a sneak peek into the future of India's legal system, this Chapter 1. It's all about setting the stage, laying down the ground rules.
And speaking of ground rules, the title itself is, well, kind of bold. Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita 2023. No messing around there, huh? This is meant to replace existing laws. But here's the thing that really jumped out at me. No firm date for when this all goes live. Why the open timeline?
It's smart, actually. Leaving that implementation date open allows for more discussion, more tweaking. And with a legal shift this big, you kind of need that breathing room, don't you? Think of it like getting all your ducks in a row before you launch.
Yeah, no rush on something this massive.
Right.
So the Sanhita applies to anything that happens within India. That's pretty clear. But then it gets interesting. It also talks about situations where this law applies outside of India. Whoa.
Exactly. This is where things get, imagine an Indian citizen commits murder in another country. Under this Sanhita, they could be tried right back in India for that. It's really trying to establish jurisdiction over offenses, even if they happen outside India, as long as an Indian citizen is involved.
Hold on, wouldn't that step on the toes of the other country's laws? What if they want to prosecute the person too? Talk about a diplomatic mess.
You've hit on a very important point. Jurisdictional conflicts are, definitely something to think about. We'll have to see how this plays out in practice. Whether there are any systems in place to handle those tricky situations.
So we know the Sanhita has a pretty wide reach geographically. But are there any exceptions to this applies everywhere idea? There's got to be some limits, right?
Of course. It clearly states it won't overrule military laws or any special local laws. Those are kind of their own separate legal bubbles.
Okay, certain areas are carved out. So we've got the scope. Now let's dig into something vital in any legal document. Definitions.
Oh, absolutely. Definitions are the building blocks. They make sure everyone understands the rules of the game in the same way. And that's especially important in criminal law.
And there are some really interesting ones in here, like dishonestly. We all use that word, but here they've tied it to the idea of causing wrongful gain or wrongful loss.
It's about intent. Did the person intend to benefit themselves unfairly or to harm someone else? That intent is key in figuring out if there's criminal liability. Think about it like this. Someone borrows your bike but forgets to return it. The law wants to know, did they intentionally keep it, knowing it was causing you a loss?
Okay, that makes the legal idea a lot more relatable. And then there's document, no surprise. It now covers electronic and digital records, emails, texts, the whole shebang.
Makes sense,
Yeah.
right? That's how we live now. Evidence isn't just on paper anymore. This update just brings the definition into the digital age.
Then there's counterfeit. Focuses on creating something fake to trick people, like fake IDs or those paintings you see, the forgeries. But it's not just copying that's the crime, right? It's the intent to deceive.
Precisely. It's that someone's trying to pass off something as real when it's not, trying to mislead others for their own gain. That intention to deceive is what makes it a crime.
Okay, so we've got a sense of the scope, some key definitions. But there's this whole section, general explanations, and frankly, it sounds a bit daunting. What's the deal with Section 3? Break it down for us.
Well, think of Section 3 as the instruction manual for the entire Sanhita. It's all about how to interpret things, making sure everyone's on the same page. It starts with highlighting the general exceptions, situations where something might seem like a crime, but actually isn't because of the circumstances.
Okay, need an example here, something a bit more relatable. The Sanhita mentions kids, but give me something adults deal with.
All right, imagine you're walking down a dark street, someone jumps out at you, right? They're waving what looks like a weapon, you defend yourself, and it turns out, whoops, it was a prank, a fake knife. Normally, using force like that could be assault. But here, the law understands you acted in self-defense. Based on what you knew at the time, you were justified. These general exceptions are all over the Sanhita, making sure things are fair.
Wow, that really makes it clear. Those general exceptions are vital. Anything else in this instruction manual we should know?
Yeah. One point is, any explanation given in one part of the Sanhita, it applies everywhere in the document. So document always means the same thing no matter where you see it, keeps it consistent.
Consistency is key, especially with law. Okay, so we've got the groundwork laid, scope, definitions, and the guidebook for how to understand everything. What's next in our deep dive into this chapter 1?
Well, this might surprise you, but it's not just what you do that matters. It's also what you don't do. Get ready to explore the world of, wait for it, acts and omissions.
All right, you mentioned acts and omissions. Sounds kind of basic. But I bet there's more to it than that.
Well, there is. It gets to the core of what responsibility means, The law isn't just about punishing you when you do something harmful. It's also about holding you accountable when you don't act, but you had a duty to. Imagine a lifeguard, right? They see someone drowning, but they just don't help. They didn't push the person in, but their inaction, well, has the same result.
Man, that's pretty heavy. So even if you haven't actively done anything wrong, just failing to act when you could have prevented something bad, that's just as serious.
Exactly. And this whole omission thing, it can get really complicated. We'll probably see a lot of debate as this Sanhita gets put into practice. But it makes you think, right, about what our responsibilities are just by being part of society.
This is where it gets real for me. Like, in my life, are there situations where I could be in trouble for something I didn't do? Suddenly very aware of my choices or lack of choices.
That's the point. The Sanhita makes you think about both sides, what you do, Andy, what you choose not to do. It's a shift in how we view responsibility.
Okay, on to another concept that caught my eye. Common intention. This feels like it could get messy fast, especially when you've got multiple people involved in a crime.
Oh, for sure, it adds layers. Common intention basically means if a group of people are working together to commit a crime, they're all equally responsible, even if they didn't all, physically do the final act. The Sanhita gives this example of poisoning. Say 2 people decide to poison someone. Each gives a small dose, not enough to be lethal on its own. But together, those doses are fatal. They're both guilty of murder, even though neither dose by itself would have done it.
So you're telling me even if I'm just involved in planning something illegal, I could be in as much trouble as the person who actually carries it out. Makes you think twice about who you hang with.
It does raise the stakes, doesn't it? This whole common intention thing, it's about recognizing that shared responsibility, that everyone involved had the intent to commit the crime. Of course, proving that in court, that's a whole other challenge. But the idea is clear. You can't just say, oh, I wasn't holding the weapon and get off scot-free.
This is like straight out of a crime drama. You get the mastermind, the guy who gets the tools, the one who actually does the deed. They're all equally guilty.
Under the concept of common intention, yeah. And that could have a huge impact on how these group crimes are handled. Will it make people less likely to get involved if they know they can be held responsible, even for a small part?
Okay, so that's common intention. Lots to think about there. Then there's this idea that different roles in a crime can lead to different offenses. So even if multiple people are involved in the same, criminal act, their level of guilt might not be the same.
You got it. The Sanhita uses the example of 2 people attacking someone. One acted in the heat of the moment, provoked by the victim. The other planned it out, cold-blooded. They both took part in the attack, but their motives, their level of blame, it's different.
So the person who is provoked, maybe they get a lesser charge, while the planner, they're facing something much more serious.
Exactly. It recognizes that things aren't always black and white. The law takes into account the circumstances, the motivations, the specific role each person played.
This whole deep dive is really showing how much nuance there is in law. It's not just good versus bad. It's understanding all the gray areas in between.
And this Sanhita, with all its emphasis on clear definitions and these explanations, it seems to be going for that. A more nuanced approach to justice. Paying attention to context.
Definitely gives us a lot to chew on, but hold up. We've covered some heavy stuff here. Acts and omissions, shared responsibility, different roles, and all that. Anything else in Chapter Abby we should know before we wrap up?
Yeah, we've hit the main points. But there are a few more pieces to this legal puzzle. Stick with us, because in the last part, we'll finish our deep dive into Chapter 1 and explore what this whole shakeup could really mean.
Okay, so here we are, the final stretch of our deep dive into Chapter 1 of this Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita. Feels like we've covered a ton, from the scope of the law to some really complex stuff. Shared responsibility, what it means to not act. Whoa.
It's true. We've been learning a whole new language, haven't we? The language of law in India. And like any language, there are all these subtle things to pick up on.
Right, it's not just the words, it's how they all work together. But beyond just definitions, we talked about some pretty big concepts, right? Acts and omissions, that whole idea of shared blame if you're part of a group, and how your specific role in a crime, well, that matters to what you're charged with.
It does. And I think one of the key takeaways from this Chapter 1 is that It's trying to do more than just update the wording of the law. It's wrestling with how complicated human behavior is,
Mm.
trying to make the legal system smarter, more nuanced, taking context into account.
Okay, so let's zoom out for a sec. Big picture time. We've spent all this time in Chapter 1, but what does it all mean? What are the big things our listeners should be walking away with?
Well, first off, it's obvious this Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, it wants to be thorough and modern. Applying even outside India, recognizing we live in a digital world now.
Mhm.
And with all these explanations, it's really trying to be clear about how to interpret things. It's facing the complexity head on.
And not shying away from tough questions like how responsibility is shared or the difference between what you do and what you don't do when that matters legally.
Exactly. Chapter 1 sets the stage for a more careful approach to justice, you could say. Emphasis on clarity, consistency, and really understanding the full story of each case.
So as our listeners go about their day with all this knowledge of Chapter 1 swirling in their heads, what should they be thinking about? What do we want them to take away from this deep dive?
Here's a question to chew on. Given how much this Sanhita focuses on both acts and omissions, does that change how we think about taking responsibility? Are we accountable not just for what we do, but also for what we choose not to do in a legal sense?
That's a great question to leave everyone with. It gets at the heart of how this whole new law could reshape how things work in India and reminds us that law, it's not stuck in time. It changes along with society as things get more complex and as our values shift.
Absolutely. And by understanding these foundations in Chapter 1, we can have better, more informed conversations about what this legal reform could really mean for each of us and for India as a whole.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita. Hope you found it as fascinating as we did. Until next time, stay curious out there, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.